So almost certainly these events helped to inspire the much better known and filmed use of code talkers speaking Navajo and other languages during World War II. We know very few details of these conversations. The code talkers, some of whom are pictured on page 1 of your handout, must surely have mystified their German listeners, in part because of their language's unfamiliar vocabulary and sound system. By the way, if you don't have a handout, you should get one, because I will be referring to the handout frequently. But very likely, the grammatical organization of what they said, so different from familiar European languages that speakers routinely describe it today as backwards, was also part of the code. The Muskegean family of languages, which includes Choctaw, the language which is the source for the name Tuscaloosa, and Chickasaw, the inspiration for the Indians who appear in the novels of William Faulkner, predominated geographically in the Aboriginal Southeast. Although there is some variation, their type of language can be considered more generally a Southeastern grammatical type, not only very different from English, but rather unusual cross-linguistically. In this talk, I will present an overview of the American Indian languages of the Southeast and a brief introduction to some features of their grammatical structure. I'll briefly discuss the most important contribution of these languages to the Southern linguistic scene, and then close this paper by reminding you of the problem of language endangerment, which threatens this important aspect of the linguistic heritage of the South. At this conference, one may appropriately ask why I'm discussing the Southeast rather than the South. In large-scale considerations of American Indian culture, the eastern third of the United States is often considered one eastern woodlands region, with its lower half known as the Southeast. And that's why I'm really referring mostly to Southeastern languages, not Southern ones. The Aboriginal Southeast was a region of considerable linguistic diversity, containing one complete language family, languages of several other large families primarily located elsewhere, and many other smaller groups and language isolates, languages not known to be related to any other group. The 13 groups for which we have linguistic documentation are presented in Table 1 on page 2 of your handout. In addition to the Muskegean family, all of whose members were located in the Southeast, the indigenous languages of the region included languages belonging to 4 other language families with representatives outside the region: Algonquian, Caddoan, Iroquoian, and Siouan, and 7 language isolates, languages that are, as far as we know, unrelated to any other languages: Adai, Atakapa, Calusa, Chitimacha, Timucuan, Tunica, and Yuchi, several of which contain more than one recognized language variety. The listing in Table 1 is based primarily on information from the Smithsonian's newest volume of the Handbook of North American Indians on the Southeast. However, I have added 3 American Indian languages of the South which are excluded by the handbook's definition of the concept Southeast: Powhatan, an Algonquin language of Virginia; Quapaw, a Siouan language of Arkansas; and Mobilian, also called Mobilian jargon, a contact language primarily based on Muskegean. The decision to add these languages to the roll of Southeastern languages is not mine alone. Powhatan and Mobilian are discussed in the first major collection of technical papers on Southeastern languages, Crawford 1975, and Quapaw is considered in the second such volume to appear later this year, edited by Hardy and Scancarelli. I'd like to put in a plug for that book if you are interested in Southeastern languages. It's a long time in coming, but I think it's going to be a good volume. Many of the languages listed in Table 1 have no living speakers and are known to us only through earlier scholars and explorers' efforts at documentation. The majority died out so long ago that we have only written records of their words. Only 4 of the 13 linguistic groups originally represented in the Southeast still have living representatives, including 9 distinct languages which are given in small capital letters on your handout. These include Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, spoken by the Muskogee and Seminole groups, which many of you heard yesterday from Margaret Malden, Alabama, Colasadi or Coshada, and Miccosukee. They also include the best-known Southeastern Indian language, the Iroquoian language Cherokee, most of whose living relatives are spoken in the Northeast, the Caddoan language Caddo, and Yuchi, a language isolate. Speakers of many of the languages were moved to other parts of the United States by the federal government so that their ancestral lands in the Southeast could be open to white settlement. The most prominent such case was the forced migration of the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokees to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears during the 1830s. A less well-known movement is that of the Tulalip, who were forced from their ancestral lands in Virginia to reservation lands in New York State and then on to Ontario. And there are others. This is not a pleasant chapter in our nation's history. Because of such removals, there has been relatively little linguistic contact between Southern Indians and other Southerners for 170 years. So many of you may know the story told by Calvin S. Brown, who reported that when his mother asked William Faulkner where he got the Chickasaws who people his stories, since there were no real-life models for them, Faulkner answered matter-of-factly, "Mrs. Brown, I made them up." Today, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, Caddo, and Yuchi languages are spoken in Oklahoma. Alabama and Coshada are spoken in Texas. Choctaw and Coshada are spoken in Louisiana. Choctaw is spoken in Mississippi. Cherokee is spoken in North Carolina. And Creek and Miccosukee are spoken in Florida. Although many of the other tribal groups listed in Table 1 are still active politically, all of the other languages are extinct. In addition to these language groups for which we have documentation, there are other Southeastern languages of whose existence we have records, but which we know little to nothing about, as listed in Table 2 on page 3. There is a long history of debate about whether groups such as the 13 in Table 1 should be viewed as completely unrelated to each other or whether there may be further connections among them. Many such relationships have been proposed. For example, Joseph H. Greenberg, who was actually my first linguistics teacher, argues that virtually all the languages of North, Central, and South America have a common ancestor language. According to his classification, all the languages listed in Tables 1 and 2 are related. Greenberg's classification is not widely accepted by specialists, however. Other less global connections that have been suggested include a Gulf group, including Muscogee, Tunica, Natchez, Chickasaw, Attakapaw, which has been linked with Algonquian, a proposed relationship of Yuchi and Siouan, and groupings of Caddoan with Iroquoian and or Siouan. All of these proposals are controversial, however, and the conservative presentation in Table 1 is what I will assume here. Now I'd like to introduce you to the structure of the languages of the Southeast and to argue for the notion of a Southeastern grammatical type. I will begin by presenting a very brief sketch of my favorite Southeastern language, Chickasaw, which I believe exemplifies this type of language. Although there are many important differences among the Muscogean languages, all of them share the structural features of Chickasaw presented here. Chickasaw is a language of the western branch of Muscogean. Originally spoken in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, the language is now spoken only in the Chickasaw Nation of south central Oklahoma. Chickasaw is very closely related to the better described language Choctaw, the language of the Code Talkers. I've been studying Chickasaw since 1977, working primarily with my longtime collaborator, Mrs. Catherine Wilmond, who was born in Macmillan, Oklahoma, but who now lives in Los Angeles, as well as with a great number of fluent speakers in Oklahoma. I estimate the current number of fluent Chickasaw speakers at under 200. All of these, to my knowledge, are over the age of 50, and most are over 70. No children are learning the language, although periodically classes are offered in Oklahoma. With Mrs. Wilman's help, I teach a brief introduction to Chickasaw every year or two at UCLA.